Mayor, you are live on YouTube. So at 6 o'clock, I'll start the recording for the meeting.
Sounds great. Thank you. All right, it's 6 o'clock, and I will call this meeting of the Legislative Subcommittee to order at 6 o'clock on August 2nd, 2021. So I called the meeting to order just for the recording, and for the record, I will say for roll call, Vice Mayor Geringer and I are now the subcommittee. Now that Councilmember Burks is no longer on the subcommittee, so I'm glad to welcome
Thank you.
Vice Mayor Geringer. And so do you have a motion to adopt the agenda?
So moved.
Great. And roll call vote, Vice Mayor Geringer?
Aye.
And I'm an aye, so we are unanimous. Oh, and then introductions. On the call, we have our fabulous Townsend Public Affairs legislative wizard, Casey Elliott, here to help guide us on legislative matters in Sacramento. So then off public comments. Do we have any public comments for items not on the agenda tonight? So if we can see if there's any hands raised.
No, Mayor, there are no public comments.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll close the public comment. All right, we'll get to the first item for bills of local importance.
Good evening. Sorry, I'm just pulling up my agenda to make sure I'm in the right spot. Good evening, everyone. As noted, Casey Elliott, State Capitol Director, Townsend Public Affairs. First measure that before the committee tonight for consideration is Assembly Bill 215 by Assemblymember Chu. This measure deals with establishing a process for a mid-cycle housing element consultation between HCD and any jurisdiction that has not made sufficient progress towards meeting its RHNA as defined within this bill. A few things I should note is this bill was amended relatively significantly right before the legislature went on recess in mid-July. So the analysis that's within the packet does reflect those amendments. So there were some other provisions that were in related to specifically to pro-housing policy requirements. Those provisions have been removed from the bill. So if there's any questions as to why I'm not going to touch on that, that's just to reflect those amendments that have been taken a couple of weeks ago. So what AB 215 still does is it contains a process beginning with the sixth housing cycle for HCD to create a mid-consultation process. So essentially, cities, in addition to their existing annual progress reports, would be required to provide information to HCD in the 5th year of the planning period, and then also a year after the RHNA planning period ends, with specific information regarding those housing targets. The bill would require a jurisdiction to enter into a consultation with HCD if it's not making relative progress within its RHNA. And so the way this bill defines relative progress, if that progress is less than half of the median jurisdiction within the COG. So it's not going to be the same for everyone, essentially. And then if an entity is deemed to not be meeting their substantial compliance, then HCD will have a consultation. They may recommend items. There'll be a back and forth. And then HCD will make recommendations and a determination. If HCD makes recommendations, a jurisdiction will have a year to implement those recommendations. And if it's not, then the jurisdiction will be deemed to be out of compliance with their housing element. And then all of the existing rules and laws and regulations that surround that process would be in place. And so This bill was also amended with those amendments that I mentioned. It did also contain some other amendments, not so much impactful to the city of Lafayette, I appreciate, but just so we're all on the same page, it did narrow the bill so it only applies to ABAG, jurisdictions within ABAG, SACOG in Sacramento, San Diego, and the SCAG, so the largest of the MPOs. So AB 215 was passed out of Housing Committee leading up to the Policy Committee, Second House Policy Committee deadline. It passed out 5-2 on July 1st. The bill is currently in Senate Appropriations Committee. For all of the bills that we talk about tonight that are in Appropriations Committee, the deadline for appropriations in the Second House is August 27th, noting that the legislature returns into session on August 16th. Any bill that obviously is held in appropriations would become a 2-year bill. Those that are advanced out will move to the floor, and then both a floor vote and a concurrence vote, if necessary, would need to occur prior to adjournment on somewhere near midnight on September 10th. Within the staff report, I did highlight a couple of the bullets that are still germane to the existing version of the bill that opponents have raised, namely that HCD already has existing authority to identify and remedy violations well before the midpoint through the annual progress report, and then also the bill, if HCD does require remediations, then that could, depending upon what those are, circumvent a public process that was established during the ARENA process. With that, the staff recommendation is to oppose based on the city's legislative platform, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Great, Vice Mayor Geringer, do you have any questions?
I will go off mute. No, I do not.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So, so the mid-year cycle, who is the bodies at HCD that would like be the overriding body that would decide? So basically it says that half the jurisdictions in the largest COGs would be consulted based on that formula, right? That's the half of the median of the COG, right? So half or more, right? Because a median is a funny number. So it could be half or more than would be consulted. But like you're saying, it's true that they could already do this because we have our annual updates and they could consult with all of us at any time. So what is so different about this? What feels different?
That was an easier question to answer on July 15th.
Okay.
when the bill previously had some of the remedies were to previously require a jurisdiction to obtain a pro-housing policy, that would have been a significant change. That wouldn't have been a remedy that's not currently available. Right now, it feels as though the main provisions of the bill are the inclusion of a mathematical number as to what would require a consultation. As you noted, HCD under this bill, HCD would be the one that would do the consultation, would make the recommendation. So it's not a separate entity or a separate body that's being established through this bill. So really, I don't have a great answer for you as to what's substantially different outside of the other one. Obviously, the goal of the author is just to ensure that housing is being planned for, and then also coming to fruition. So that's kind of like the author's general standpoint, but within it, I can't point to some magical thing within this bill that is going to result in more production, other than, like I said, just the general consultation process within HCD.
Okay, City Manager.
There may be a subtle change, and that is in the past, HCD, I don't think had the authority to ask cities to make changes to their housing elements mid-cycle. And this appears to be a new change. And correct me if I'm wrong, Casey. that seems to be quite different than what our current practice is, which is really reporting on what we did, but not facing HCD until the end of the cycle for the next RENA update. So the fact that they can come in mid cycle and mandate that we make some changes to our housing element. And if we don't within a year find housing elements out of compliance.
That is different. Yeah. Feels
Yeah,
different.
it seems to be. And, you know, I'm sure most cities say this, we approve projects, we don't build them. So it's sometimes the applicant may sit on a project for many years and we may be found out of compliance because building permits are not issued.
Right, because
And-
it's right,
Yeah.
because we've already approved a bunch that
Yeah.
aren't being built right now. So yeah.
Yeah, and I should note, in a previous version of this bill, I'd have to go back and check if it was remained through the significant strikeouts that were taken in July. The bill did make points that cities could be providing information as to why the housing isn't being built, particularly for issues beyond their control. I think, which is why there is a consultation process and not just if you are lower, you're going to be out of compliance. So I think that there's intended to be some give and take and some level of acknowledgement that sometimes housing occurs for reasons outside of a city's control. As Nirup mentioned, yeah, and that was an oversight on my part. Obviously, the ability for HCD to kind of have the back and forth prior to a housing element being found out of compliance would be a change. As I noted, if those steps or those recommendations made by HCD weren't implemented within a year, then the housing element would, city would fall out of compliance on their housing element, and then all of the existing remedies there would apply under the Attorney General and all of the other enforcement mechanisms.
Okay, great. Professor McGarry.
Yeah, so just confirming that the authority that HCD has now, or the way that it's actually done in practice, Nirup was that, or City Manager Savatsa, is that the reports are sent in, but what I heard you say is that they really are just kind of go in, they're perfunctory, but there's not a consultation give and take until the end of the cycle. So, I mean, it's just sort of the reports go in, somebody reviews them, make sure that the information is there. And so that's where the big change is when I was reading it. But one of my questions, and I thought that there is kind of a give it, like they would call you out if you weren't doing something, but that's not happening now until the end of the cycle.
No, they do publish the annual reports of all the cities. It's on the HCD website. And we've had people look at the production of all the cities and rank them, so to speak. But to date, at least in Lafayette, we have not had conversations with HCD during the cycle, but really at the end when we resubmit an updated housing element.
But I imagine if they thought that we were out of compliance with our housing element, that would cause them to come in.
Certainly.
Right.
So I guess there are two things. One is the sheer number. How are you producing? Mm-hmm. And the other is there anything in your element that's now out of compliance given changes in state law?
And we have to report on that anyway. Right? Yeah. We're reporting on that anyway. And so if we were out of compliance, they would know and they would come and consult with us, right?
Yeah.
This is just another way for them to talk to us. Even when we're not out of compliance, they can talk to us anyway and tell us what to do without public input. And that's a pretty big change. So I am not in favor of this. You're right. If they chose to come in and talk to us early, you're right, they could do it whether or not we are in compliance or not, right?
Yeah.
So, and we are already reporting, we're already doing things. And yeah, I'm definitely a strong opposed.
I support the staff recommendation as well.
Me too. Great. Okay. Is that all you need from us, Casey?
Yep, as
Oh.
long as I don't know if you need to take an
Public-
official vote on that, but I'm,
And do we have to have public comment? Or are we going to do public comment on each one of these?
You can.
Or
We're the only ones here. but-
Do not see any
Okay,
public.
great. So we'll take it officially at the end unless we start to see people come on. So Suzanne, will you tell us if we start seeing people to come on?
Will do.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, great. So we are opposed. So let's go on to 602.
AB 602 is Assemblymember Grayson's current bill this year related to impact fees in Nexus studies. This bill would make a number of changes to the Nexus studies prepared by cities. Chief among them is it would require HCD, excuse me, by 2024 to create a Nexus fee study template that could be used by local governments to determine their Nexus fees, which would include the method of feasibility of housing construction. It would require local jurisdictions to post their fee schedules in special districts, excuse me, to post a fee schedule on their website. Would require upon request from a development proponent, and the city manager and I spoke about this being a significant change. Upon the excuse me, that the total amount of fees and extractions associated with a project would be received upon the issuance of a certificate of occupancy or final inspection, whichever is later. And then that information would also need to be updated and posted on the city's website. And then there are elements related to Nexus fees that are already in place. And like I said, starting with new Nexus fee studies, once the template is used, it would require local governments to utilize that. And then it exempts local governments from using that Nexus fee study if certain conditions are met. So number of items within the bill itself was approved by the Senate Housing Committee prior to the adjournment of summer recess. It is currently in the Assembly Appropriations Committee, scheduled to be considered on the hearing on the day the legislature returns on the 16th. I would assume that given the workload that's being given to HCD under this bill, that it will be referred to the suspense file and ultimately taken up on April 27th. There is a coalition letter of opposition, opposed unless amended coalition letter that's included within your packets from CSAC, League of Cities, Urban and Rural Counties, as well as the APA, stating their objections to the bill. The staff recommendation that I included was watched, but based on conversations with the city manager, I believe that may be an oppose or an oppose unless amended. I don't have that one right.
You said oppose unless amended.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, questions, the timing of the payments, that's wild. And so to me, it was the HCD is the wrong agency to create the template, was my take. Like who would be the right people or group of people if we were going to actually do this for real and create something that was really useful for cities? Like who would we go out to actually help us implement this other than HCD, right? Do you know who that would be?
Yeah, within the coalition's oppose unless amended letter, they suggest having essentially a Nexus fee study clearinghouse housed at the Office of Planning and Research. So it'd be more of so instead of having a singular template, you'd more or less have peer groups that you could draw from to see what other people have used. And OPR would essentially act as the state clearinghouse, not necessarily establishing content or ranking them or scoring them in any particular way, but would be able to make those resources available to other jurisdictions, so they could again kind of compare amongst, rural, suburban, urban size demographics, and could look and see what other people have done, community needs, to try to find the right fit and then utilize those existing templates. So from the league and CSAC and their provisions, they don't necessarily suggest a replacement entity instead of HCD. One of the things they also note is that HCD doesn't necessarily have it doesn't necessarily have significant experience in all types of development that would be that would apply to the nexus fees, the commercial, the industrial, some of these other elements. While they may be versed in housing and multifamily housing projects and what those may be, that obviously doesn't encompass the entirety of who would be subject to these fee studies.
Okay, great. Do you have any questions, Vice Mayor?
I did have a question on the other item in the CalCities, where it talks about, first of all, thank you, Nirup and Casey, for adding the amendment about the timing of the payments. That's of the fees. That's huge, a huge catch. So thank you. I appreciated the clearinghouse. But can you talk a little bit more about does the capital improvement planning, the second part of their concerns, how does that directly impact us in Lafayette? I think that was the second point that they rose. There was something else too about the Mitigation Fee Act and expanding it to commercial and industrial, but I wasn't really clear how. Or actually, it doesn't impact us anymore because they changed it. Was that an amendment to change it over 250, the population?
Yeah.
Does that mean the Marin County isn't in there? Again?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how does it?
One of the.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I know in one of the previous grace and impact fee bills from 2018, there were some provisions related to capital improvement planning as best practices, and I think that my recollection of that was it kind of evolved into that because there wasn't significant state there wasn't any state funding right. tied along to it, so it kind of turned into a best practice. It would seem to me that this is kind of trying to revisit that issue. I think ultimately where the author is trying to go is trying to pair up the mitigation fees or the impact fees to actual tangible projects that need to be done, preferably identified within a CIP or some other planning document, so there can kind of be a one-to-one. I think that's generally historically kind of where the conversation's been at.
Okay. And then, yes, Mayor, I did appreciate that. Are we carving out for different, creating the limits on the size of the population to carve out in negotiations with other members? But okay, that was the question. I think on the timing, I think unless amended, I'm supportive of the staff recommendation and very much supportive of I'm not saying this right. So I'm supportive of the staff recommendation that we're opposing unless amended, in support of the coalition letter that was sent, but also adding in the specific amendment about timing.
Yeah, great. I guess I could be okay with that. I'm not sure that the amended part, I'm not as happy with the amended part because I don't think, I mean, they'd have to completely gut this thing at this point to take HCD out of it, right? I mean, this is just they'd have to completely change it. And so does that fall? It feels like unless amended, it's like means that, oh, HCD isn't part of this, right? And that doesn't sound like easy amendment. And I appreciate that their thing, but as long as I guess we refer to Cal Cities, because I don't think that they're going to accept anything but a complete gut, it sounds like, and having this other complete method. So I guess that it would be okay as long as we do refer to the letter. But
Yeah,
boy,
and I
it's
think
a
it
pretty
does
big
in-
amendment.
Yeah, I mean, in the recommended action, I mean, it does say just what you said, as amended for the reasons listed in the league's letter. And as long as that's, really clear, and we know that the league is advocating as well. And I think, well, I haven't talked to specifically to anybody in the office, but I know that Casey does that. I think the argument for a clearinghouse of people who are very much involved in the work, and have that expertise just seems to make such good logical sense that if it means you have to, in order to get support of, a larger group of folks, that you have to gut it, then, that's what needs to happen. But I think that the oppose unless amended is pretty clear.
Okay.
Unless Nirup or Casey, you think there's some other language that.
No, I think the position is good. The one thing I would note, and I don't want to go too far down the road of speculating as to why the league and that association took that particular position, but I would note that over the last several years, those entities have worked with Assemblymember Grayson on his various impact fee bills. So I have a suspicion that instead of just coming out with a straight opposed position, they at least wanted to provide some substantive amendments that could get them to neutral. To the mayor's point, whether or not they're accepted is probably a completely different question. But I think within the framework and the working group and the working relationship they have with that office, to me, it would be understandable if they felt the need to at least come forward with something that could get them to a neutral position.
Okay. Great. So I think we're both okay with the oppose unless amended. With the addition of what Teresa said, is to make sure that the billing when we actually get the fees makes sense. Do we have any public comment? Is there anybody else out there?
Well, I don't know if they have comment, but there's somebody in the waiting room.
Oh, there is. Okay. We'll take
There is an
public comment then.
attendee in the audience. So if any members of the public would like to comment, use the raised hand feature in Zoom or press *9 on your phone to let us know if you'd like to make a comment on this item. There are no hands raised.
Okay, great. So we can go on to SB 52.
Right. Senate Bill 52 is a measure by Senator Dodd. Essentially, this bill would define one of these days I'm going to pronounce this right, a de-energization event. Man, that's a tough one for me. A PSPS event would qualify that as a condition that could constitute a local emergency. So with that, the local governments would have the ability to seek reimbursement for certain things, such as, for example, setting up a local EOC during a PSPS event or other elements. The bill has been moving through the legislature with bipartisan support. It moved out of the Assembly Emergency Management Committee unanimously 7-0 on July 5th. The bill is currently on the Assembly floor, awaiting consideration. Once it is approved by on the Assembly floor, assuming there are no amendments before it's taken up, that measure will move directly to the governor's office for his consideration. The bill to date has no official opposition and is supported by a number of public entities, including ACWA, the Association of California Water Agencies, fire chiefs, fire districts association, the league, RCRC, and a handful of cities as well. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Ms. McGregor?
So just to clarify, it is basically just adding in that PSPS events are, it's basically changing or adding in the definition that they comply or are an example of a de-energization. Turns out that actually it doesn't, that's not a word. I mean, it might be, but it's really what we're supporting is that it changes it so that it also then is allowed reimbursement of, fees and costs and expenses. And since it's becoming part of our reality, I am absolutely in support of the staff's recommendation. Mm-hmm. And thank you, Casey, for saying that it would be going directly to the governor. And so when it would take effect immediately, or as soon as he signed it, or is it a January? I was just trying to. Will it be in place for this fall?
Fire season?
Yeah. The bill is does not have an.
It's not an urgent.
So
yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So this would be a January 1. Should we get into the level of speculation? I'm going to. This bill was originally proposed for the consent calendar on the Assembly. The bill was pulled off the Assembly consent calendar by Assemblymember Aguiar Curry, who, generally speaking, given her district, I would assume would be a strong proponent of this bill. One possible amendment that she could be looking for is exactly as you said, adding an urgency clause to this bill so it goes in. The bill, like I said, it's been unopposed as it's moved through the legislature, so it definitely has a 2/3 level of support to justify to meet the vote threshold for an urgency clause. So this is definitely one that I have an eye on for when they come back. So an urgency clause, I would say at this point, is not out of the realm of possibility.
Okay.
Right. City Manager Monroe?
Can I, Casey, would it help if cities recommended that this be treated as an urgency bill?
That's definitely something I'd be happy to include in the letter.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And for the committee, all your recommendations are going to the council on August the 23rd. So we will have, we'll add this to the letter at the time.
Great. All right, so do we have any public comment?
If any members of the public wish to speak on this item, please use the raised hand feature in Zoom or press *9 on your telephone. Mayor, I do not see any public comment on this item.
Great. So I don't need a roll call vote, but I believe both Vice Mayor Gehringer and I are in support of the staff recommendation of support, plus the addition of asking if we could push to make it urgent.
Mm-hmm.
All right, SB 109.
The next bill is Senate Bill 109, also by Senator Dodd, related to wildfires. This bill would establish the Office of Emergency Technology Research and Development within Cal OES, as well as an advisory board to oversee the work of that department. The bill would then task the new department to improve state and local emergency preparation and planning, incident responses, command and control, emergency threats due to emergencies. Obviously, knowing Mr. Dodd, this is driven by the recent wildfire, the last several years worth of wildfire incidents we've had. The bill goes further to direct the department to talk, to develop research and development programs on various types of technologies, communications, modeling, response, who to consult with, private entities, public entities, and then also to consult with CAL FIRE. The department would be comprised of specific members within the state government, as well as representatives from academics, emergency response, local governments, and first responders. I should note the bill does contain a sunset, so that as contained within the within this legislation, the department would be established through the end of 2028, and then obviously the department would be would share this information and the items that they develop with local governments. The bill itself has also passed out of the Assembly Emergency Management Committee at the same hearing that SB 52 did on July 5th. This bill is currently in Appropriations Committee. I assume, given the establishment of a new State Department with an advisory board, that this is going to be a suspense candidate, so I would anticipate that this will be considered on August 27th. The bill, as I noted, has had strong bipartisan support as it's moved through the process. There has been some opposition concern from the ACLU regarding some of the technology that they felt could be targeted at communities for reasons other than emergency response. There were amendments taken to the bill recently. I included a note in the staff report that based on my reading of the ACLU's issues and the amendments, I think the amendments will likely resolve their concern, but did still want to note their opposition. The bill itself has had support from the Fire Chiefs Association, the Fire Districts of California, the League, as well as a number of different cities and counties. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great. So, when in your comments, I did notice that the two members of the advisory committee, backgrounds in victim services and privacy civil liberties, they're not suggesting to make it a 6-person board. They're going to keep it at 4, but 2 of those in there somehow in their backgrounds have to have those. Mm-hmm. Is that how I'm reading that?
Correct. Correct, and that's part of the amendments that I think were meant to address the ACLU's concerns, is giving them representation on the advisory committee. But yes, the 4 members, there would be the 3 members that would be the Secretary of the Natural Resources, Cal OES, and Cal FIRE. 4 to be appointed by the governor. The bill is, I would say, somewhat vague. If someone appointed by the governor could have multiple pieces of their background to satisfy, and then there would be the victim services in the ACLU would be specific appointments by the speaker and the pro tem.
I did not read this correctly the first time. It is absolutely right here. I'm sorry. That was I missed that on the first run through. Got it. Super.
No, it's no worries. And like I said, I believe there's some additional language in there, but those 2 appointments, I don't want to presume where people remove their opposition, but that is definitely I would consider a concession based on that line of opposition. So I haven't seen them official correspondence from the ACLU removing their opposition, but I think it's pretty safe to say that that's why those 2 appointments are in there.
Got it. Okay, so any thoughts, Vice Mayor?
Happy to support. Always a little concerned about creation of new government departments and agencies, but I do think that this is important. I mean, we're going through, and here we've experienced, because of the relationship with Moraga Arenda Fire and their chief, and Con Fire and Chief Aldrich, that there are a lot of innovative technology and research going on. I mean, we are very fortunate because we have that. I know that there have been bills in the past that had said, please have these things. What's the wildfire tracking in place. I think Senator McGuire had a bill a couple of years ago, and it was specifically related to incident sort of reporting, and when a fire breaks out, everybody can kind of know where it is. I don't know what the status and where we were in meeting that requirement, but I think that making a concerted effort at research and development in this area so that we're being proactive rather than reactive is an important thing to do. So I would support the staff recommendation, and I'm sure we'll be looking at this again after August 22nd in the second year of the session, but because it is that's a big financial ask, and I would think that I'm not the only one who would want to be really thoughtful about adding another government agency, even though it has a great cause. So I support the staff recommendation. Yeah.
Right. So my question is that these only would recommend to Cal OES, right? And so, or it wouldn't address all of our federal lands. Yes, that's my question. This would only apply to California land, or would they make recommendations for lands in California that maybe are federally owned?
Great question.
I think that with depending upon the type of research or development, these could be items that have broader applicability. For example, on communications and response, best practices, those types of things that could obviously extend to state, private, or federally owned land. Similarly, if they made recommendations, for example, on microgrids or other elements, those could have applicability, to different types of, jurisdictions or land. Again, federally, microgrids, maybe not for federal forest land, but yeah, I think that given the nature of the research, it could have applicability beyond just Cal OES or Cal Fire territories. Great.
But you're right, I do support it. And I hope that they would make sure that they do study the rest of California, and try to have a broad look about all California.
Great point. Great question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so do we have any public comment?
Mayor, there are no public attendees in the Zoom meeting currently.
Okay, great. So, all right. So yes, so we both support, and we don't have to talk about timing or anything, do we? We don't. Okay.
The next measure, if we're ready to move on, is we're going to continue on with Senator Dodd's bill package. Though this one I have a sneaking suspicion we might come to a different conclusion on, is Senate Bill 556. This bill would pertain to the installation of small wireless facilities on streetlights and traffic poles. So the bill would require access to those local hardware for reasonable terms, reasonable conditions. The bill sets forth a number of different provisions related to applications to install small wireless facilities, and timing that local governments would need to review those requests, the conditions under which they could deny those requests or request that accommodations be made to facilitate those facilities being placed on the streetlights and traffic poles. The bill also sets forth a application cost, basically a reasonable cost that could be charged for the review of these applications. So essentially, it would be less than or equal to $270 for each small wireless attachment. So it would also, I should note, it would allow anything that's currently under contract to remain under contract. But if those contracts are renegotiated or renewed, then they would be subject to the revised fees schedule contemplated in this bill. And then the bill also does contain provisions now that would require the service providers to provide reports to the legislature annually, beginning at the end of 22, on the progress towards meeting the goals of universal broadband. So the information on the level of deployment and where these facilities are being deployed. The measure has been moving through the legislature. It most recently moved out of the Assembly Communications and Conveyance Committee 11-1 on July 7th. That bill has been referred to the Appropriations Committee, the Assembly Appropriations Committee. It is likely to be on the same schedule of moving to suspense and then being dealt with towards the end of the month of August. The measure has support amongst technology providers, some in the education space, as well as a number of different business groups. The bill does have significant opposition from the League of Cities, as well as several dozen individual cities. The staff recommendation is to oppose the bill, kind of going back several years on this topic, but just overall, you know, the not just the issues of local control over siting of facilities, but also we do have FCC orders in this space that local governments are working on implementing. This bill in some areas is not necessarily consistent with FCC orders. So does create some potential for some confusion on the implementation side should this bill go through. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Vice Mayor Garangay.
So it did cause me pause. I do understand why the education community, and I noted that Contra Costa County education, because of the impacts that, you know, we all knew were there, but have been heightened and made more aware because of the pandemic in terms of access to broadband and Wi-Fi and hotspots and everything. I get why they're on there from a local control and the FCC, you know, that it's in conflict potentially with regulations that are already in place. I guess I'm curious why, beyond the statement about reducing bureaucracy and providing a clearer pathway to be able to approve these types of projects, do you have a sense, Casey, why the author is pushing on this when there's already legislation in place that we're working to implement?
Great question. I think that ultimately, I mean, I think a lot of this goes back to just the continued desire by the legislature to speed up the deployment of 5G and broadband. Obviously, the current pandemic just has really kind of shown a light on that issue as a whole. Not to necessarily equate this issue with housing, but I think that there tends to be a common theme that, you know, were it not for local government, we would just have, you know, small cell wireless facilities on every, you know, on every block. So I think that there is some of just that general feeling that some local governments could be a hindrance to this for issues that individual legislators may not deem worthy. Ultimately, the way the bill is structured, it tries to build upon the existing framework for utility poles by expanding it to traffic lights and streets, you know, and street poles. So in some sense, it's an expansion of existing state law. Of course, there's additional modifications, but I think that's probably where the author is coming from, is that we already have something in place for utility poles. So why not just push that out in the effort to increase 5G and broadband deployment to these similar types of infrastructure?
Okay, so down now specifically to the poles and the other things that are there. So, you know, the county, CCTA and, you know, cities are looking at putting more cameras on poles and traffic lights and, things like that. And I'm not sure in reading this that I understand how that would impact our ability to have those poles for our own data, the cameras, let's say, and part of that is also a public safety. It's about wildfires. It's about potentially doing counter flow through these smart lights or smart signals. How does that impact our ability to still have control over that?
Yeah, one of the things the bill does is it does state that a local government can deny an application for a number of reasons, including insufficient capacity or safety concerns. It does provide the applicant an opportunity to remedy some of those things. So I don't know exactly if it's I don't know how you would remedy necessarily a capacity issue or how they would propose to, but I'm sure there's some clever folks over at the providers that would think of a way. But it does at least contemplate that as a reason for denial, and it does include within that core traffic or streetlight service. So I would think it would be reasonable if, for example, if it was a traffic camera or or something else related to the function of, particularly a traffic pole. Light pole might be a little bit, street light might be a little bit more difficult to make that case on, but at least it does provide some ability to have that. I think the author anticipates that there might be a give and take within that process, but at least capacity and public safety are noted as valid reasons for denying a pole attachment request.
Yeah, I saw that, and I did see the sort of all the ways that they could still shift it to have us do it, to make us do it anyway.
Right. I mean, I think practically, what would probably happen is that, it would be a denial could be sent, and the remedy for that denial would probably be so cost prohibitive that a provider may just go to another pole or another infrastructure
Right.
From a cost perspective.
And then I might have another question later, but remind me, has this bill in some form been coming through either by Senator Dodd or others?
We had, you spend so much time on it, you think you'd remember the bill numbers. I would say it was 634 several years ago. That was the utility bill by Hueso, and this, honestly, at the state level, this kind of died down for a while. So there hasn't been bills on this the last year or two while things were moving through the FCC process. So 556 has been was newly introduced this session. I do not recall a bill on this topic last year.
Okay. Well, I just meant it felt like that this was a big thing for a little while, and then I think 15 months of COVID and we've lost track of time. But that's all the questions for right now.
Yeah, so that was my question was, how does this relate to, that they use broadband, but this is 5G, right? I think that's misleading. They shouldn't do that because they're definitely fundamentally different pieces of hardware. So this does not refer to anything to like true broadband, right? This is all 5G. These are all the small cells. It's only 5G, right? And so in that big, I know you're going to talk about your the budget. And so I know Newsom put in a lot of money into more rural broadband, which has to be broadband because 5G doesn't work rural. And so, but do you know if any of that big money that Newsom's going to spend does get onto 5G, or if it's really strictly broadband?
At this point, the budget broadband issues have been kind of classified as a state kind of middle mile broadband infrastructure, which would be under the state control. And then there's been talk about additional funding for last mile, which would be kind of more the local government, the local on the street elements. Those bills haven't the funding programs for those at this point, while they've been established in the budget, haven't been fully fleshed out. While conversations have been going on at the state and federal level, I haven't heard people talking about 5G and broadband interchangeably. So my understanding on at least on that funding is that it's for true broadband and not for small cell wireless issues. But until the actual guidelines and funding eligibility comes out for those dollars, we won't officially know. But for the most part, at least the conversations I've been part of, it hasn't involved the small cell. It's been purely broadband.
Right. And then my other one is that those fees, how would those fees affect Lafayette? Is that a big deal or is that a small deal? Just a total swag.
I don't know, Mayor. It's $270 a poll, right? Or we can establish something else.
At most 270 a poll. Right?
At the most. So let's assume, and I think we would have to enter into a master agreement with whoever is asking for these facilities. And that is a sizable amount of money that could be used for in the downtown. Because I would imagine, Casey, that the primary location for 5G would be poles that are closer to one another because it's a distance issue. So we are talking about the ornamental streetlights as well as the traffic signal poles. So that could be quite substantial for the city.
And right, and it's I imagine it's 270 per pole per provider.
Per provider, and if they co-locate, Casey, we can ask for the same from each provider.
I would assume if they're separate applications for the same pole, that yes, you could have multiple contracts and fees associated with those.
So, but it's my understanding the FCC one, I know they only talked about utility poles, but it seems like we could approve ones on light poles and street lights if we chose to.
Yes.
Is that true? Right.
In the past, we have received requests for facilities on both. Yes.
Great. So to me, this one seems like it would make you say yes, unless for whatever, some big reasons, but we can also choose to do it in the places that make sense. Right. And that seems like what we would do. Like given if it came to us, we would say, oh, this makes sense. And the ones way out there, what are you doing? You know,
Right.
or something. We would want to have a little bit of playroom.
Right.
If it didn't make sense, if they were on the streetlights, if another place made a lot, was right next to it, that was better.
Yeah. And I don't know how much authority we have in this bill to negotiate where it goes.
Right.
Or whether we have to use the criteria that Casey talked about, insufficient capacity or future use of a pole as reasons to deny a certain location. A few years ago, we got a vendor who wanted to use all our ornamental the lights.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to add the facilities on those lights, and they really changed what the light looked like.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. And then it got in the way of banners. So at that point in time, I think we were advised that we don't have much authority to say you can do this pole, but not the other.
So we just denied the whole thing. Or no, we couldn't even have a point.
Away. We said you need to show, at that point in time, we had just started negotiations, and we said you need to pay for each pole. Tell us what you're proposing, but that entity went away.
Okay. Okay. All right. So I agree with staff recommendations to oppose for a bunch of the different reasons, and just to hopefully we can control where these things go when they do come, and we'll make the right decisions when they do come.
So I agree. The other piece to Niroop's point about aesthetics, under this bill, Casey, now we do have some flexibility other than what's, limited under the FCC regulations. But under this bill, we'd be limited even more on aesthetics and safety and all of those things.
Yeah, this bill would prohibit, from unreasonably denying the accommodation to the
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, I support the staff recommendation.
Okay, do we have any public comment? Suzanne?
Mayor, there are currently no attendees in the Zoom
Right.
meeting.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we will agree with staff on an opposed position. Thank you.
And the last measure that before you this evening is Senate Bill 619 by Senator Laird. As I'm waiting for my system to pull up, this bill is related to the SB 1383 targets. Essentially, SB 1383 required Cal Recycle to impose diversion mandates due to the state government being as the state government is, as well as the impacts of the pandemic. The regulations that were supposed to be adopted by Cal Recycle on January 1st of 2020 weren't approved until November of 2020. That said, they still had the effective date of January 1st, 2022. There's obviously concern of the ability for local governments to meet this target. So SB 619 is trying to find a solution to that. The bill itself would essentially delay until 23 Cal Recycle's ability to impose a penalty on a local government for failure to meet 1383. So essentially 619 is saying Cal Recycle can only impose a penalty to a local jurisdiction if the local jurisdiction is not making a reasonable effort to comply with the 1383 regulations between now and January 1, 2023. I would note that originally, as this bill was being discussed, and there was desire to delay the effective date of the regulations, Cal Recycle, the administration, and several other environmental stakeholders were resistant to that, fearing that it could lead to a slippery slope where the regulations might never go into effect. So this was the middle ground that was reached, and kind of how we got to the way this bill is phrased the way it is, and how it shapes up the way it is. With that, I'm happy. I should note the bill has been moving through the legislature with strong bipartisan support. It was considered in the Assembly Natural Resources Committee in late June and passed out 11-0. It's currently in the Assembly Appropriations Committee, and at this point, the bill has significant support from a number of local governments and cities, as well as the League, RCRC, and a handful of recycling entities. The bill does have opposition from two entities within Yolo County who are concerned that jurisdictions may just make a minimal effort to try to comply with the regulations, and thereby the state would lose a year of benefit from these regulations. Staff recommendation is to support this measure, and with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Vice Mayor Garinger.
So I don't really have questions. I did note that in the handful of recycling groups who have taken a support position, our JPA Recycle Smart, as part of the Contra Costa Solid Waste Authority, has taken a support position and has discussed this at length, and has taken the support position even though we in Contra Costa County and our Recycle Smart organization actually is moving forward with implementation and has partnered with White Pony Express on the food rescue program. And so while recognizing that even under the current deadlines, we as a agency would still be meeting that reasonable effort criteria or test. Other cities and states, other cities and counties and jurisdictions throughout the state are not anywhere near there. And even with all that Contra Costa, has already sort of set up in this space, it's still going to be a struggle for cities to meet the requirements for the composting. And I know, Nirup, I keep meaning to talk to you or to whoever on staff is, would be working with them. I know there's an ordinance and all kinds of things that have to take place. And so I very much support this. The other piece on not giving, the bill was passed and then Cal Recycled, had a whole long list of regulations that were not in that original, in the original piece. It gave them the authority to set it. And so some of it is very, what the goal is good, but some parts of it are very onerous on the agencies that have to implement. But to Senator Laird carrying this bill as the, natural resources and big environmental proponent, I don't put a lot of faith into the argument that he would be doing anything to make it less, good for the environment. I think that it's just really about helping cities implement after the pandemic. So very much in support.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for all the background information. I supported it just looking at the list of people, but thank you for the additional information that we will be doing our best to not delay.
Yeah.
So I am also in support. Thank you. And do we have any public comment? Just.
No, Mayor, there are currently no members in the Zoom meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so now I'll go to our legislative update.
Yeah, so it's been busy. Lot going on in the legislature. Obviously, as I noted earlier, they've been on summer recess for the last 2 weeks or so. But prior to the legislative recess, the legislature was busy really focusing on kind of wrapping up the state budget, as well as moving bills through the Second House Policy Committee. We saw a number of bills continue to move, particularly within the housing realm, noted within the legislative update. Particularly wanted to note Senate Bill 9 by Senator Atkins, passed out of the Housing and Community Development Committee, as well as the Local Government Committee. That measure is headed to the Assembly Appropriations Committee for consideration. And then also Senate Bill 10 by Senator Wiener. That measure was approved by those same two committees. Since that bill is not fiscal, or does not have a state fiscal impact, that bill has referred directly to the Assembly floor. Once the legislature returns and a floor manager is assigned for SB 10, it will be eligible to be taken up on the Assembly floor. So a number of bills moved through, kind of too long of a laundry list to go through all of them, but suffice to say, anything that passed out of Policy Committee is either on the floor or an Appropriations Committee, and then the remainder have become two-year bills. One brief distinction, and it applies to bills that miss the Second House Policy Committee deadline and will also apply to any bills that miss the Second House Fiscal Committee deadline. Since those bills have already advanced to the Second House, while they will become two-year bills, they won't need to move in January since they've already passed out of their House of Origin. Whereas other bills that failed to make it out of their original Policy Committee or Fiscal Committee, those are the bills will be considered in January. So any bills that kind of fail these deadlines are really going to be put on hold for about a year or so. We'll probably see those bills moving next June or so. or be eligible to be considered. So just a slight distinction there. Outside of policy committee bills, as I noted, the legislature spent a good portion of July in the new fiscal year working with the governor's office to flesh out some more of the details that were contained in the original budget proposal that was signed in early July. We saw a number of budget trailer bills that were introduced and passed. Again, they kind of fleshed out some of the details and kind of put some meat on the bones of its funding proposals, including the details for some of the homeless funding that we saw come out and other housing programs. Also, some of the transportation as it relates to local streets and roads, the Clean California program, which is for local public agencies to clean up and not just homeless encampments, but can be used to help mitigate some of the impacts from that as well. And then we've also saw some of the economic development bill pass, which I know we've talked about, Johan talked about it at council meeting. He presented that, but also contains different funding programs that are going to come up for other small businesses to tap into. So a number of different items there. We also saw the governor sign a budget trailer bill, as I noted earlier, related to broadband. We've started to see some early discussions about what that'll look like, but essentially the broadband proposal contains $2 billion for this last mile of connectivity, which will be eligible for local governments, and then also a $3.25 billion pot for kind of this middle mile, which my understanding is will largely be state maintained facilities. And then also another $750 million pot to help local governments and others issue bonds for municipal broadband deployment. So to help create a financing mechanism there. As part of the broader budget proposal, or kind of in late, there's so many different versions of the budget process we've had this year, but in the June budget process, didn't want to note there was an extension of the state's eviction moratorium, which is now of more importance given that the federal eviction moratorium has expired, and it doesn't look like there's federal legislation coming anytime soon to extend that. The state's rental eviction moratorium will run through September. Also realigns the state's program a little bit for the use of the federal funds to help with rental arrears. Most notably, makes it easier for tenants to apply for that funding outside of landlords, and then also covers back rent up to 100%. The earlier version of the state program only covered up to 80% of back rent, so there was some hesitancy, particularly for landlords to access the funding because they were going to not receive all that they were entitled to. Ideas, obviously, for the state to continue to roll out this money and get as much out the door as possible. I think pretty much everyone, while there's been a lot of negotiation amongst the various factions on the eviction moratorium and the rental assistance, I think one thing everyone can agree on is that they want the federal, particularly the federal money, to roll out as quickly as possible. So hopefully we'll see some increases in that area. In looking at the staff report, I feel that so much has happened on the COVID front since I wrote this a week and a half ago. But I guess the things that I will point out at the end of July on the 26th, Governor Newsom did announce there would be a mandate for all state employees as well as healthcare workers, both public and private, would require vaccination or regular testing. This has since then this has been adopted in several other places. We've seen a number of cities, I should say a handful of cities. I don't want to overstate it. A handful of cities, LA, Long Beach, San Francisco, have instituted similar mandates for their employees. We've seen a number of companies, particularly in the Bay Area in the tech sector, Google, Facebook, Uber, Lyft, implement the same thing on the private side. There's also been the CSU has voted that they are going to require students, faculty, and staff all to receive vaccinations if they're planning to be on campus for the fall semester. UC had previously passed a vaccine mandate, though theirs, I should note, is predicated on a full FDA approval of the vaccine. So that one's slightly different. And then, as though that wasn't enough, we then saw the CDC update their masking guidance, and the state has followed through on the masking recommendations. I know there's also been activity within most of the Bay Area counties related to masking, but generally speaking, indoor masking is recommended or required, depending upon where you're at, for all individuals, regardless of vaccination status. And then lastly, I did want to note that the state capitol also has several weeks ago reinstituted their mask mandate. Over the course of the last month or so, there's been several confirmed cases. I don't want to say an outbreak. There's been 15 to 20 cases within the state capitol amongst staff since the capitol is reopened to the public. Given that concern, the masking mandate has been reinstituted in the Capitol. Capitol remains open for limited public engagement, interaction, and I think that the Assembly and Senate are kind of playing things by ear. I think that if there continue to be more positive cases, we may see at least the state Capitol regress back to limiting or curtailing the ability for the public to enter into the building but that still is yet to be determined. So with all of that, there's a lot of stuff going on, and I'm happy to answer any questions on any of those items.
Great. Okay, Vice Mayor Geringer, I also have
Go ahead.
questions.
We're probably going to ask the similar question that we talked about at the beginning of the meeting.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Just in talking about at our last meeting, one of our colleagues, Councilmember Anduri, had asked that we discuss at our upcoming meeting, encourage writing to the governor or encouraging an extension of the executive order to allow us to continue to meet virtually, just due to everything that's going on. Are you hearing any rumblings? I know the bills didn't seem, they started a discussion about it, but it didn't seem to be going anywhere. So have you heard anything else?
Yeah, so as you noted, there's two bills moving through, AB 339, which is limited to large jurisdictions over 250,000, so would not directly apply to the city. And then Assembly Bill 361, which, if my memory serves me correctly, the city has taken in a support position on, which would allow for the continued operation as you'd come accustomed to if there's a local state of emergency in place. Both of those bills are moving through, though between you, me, and everyone else listening in or watching us recorded on YouTube, I have my suspicions as to 339's ability to make it out of Appropriations Committee. From an administration standpoint, I have not yet heard of conversations to amend the previous executive order, which included the September 30 deadline. That said, every conversation I've had with the administration over the last year and a half as it relates to Brown Act has basically been, we understand, we know there's issues, we'll let you know, and then they publish something. So not necessarily out of character for them to remain tight-lipped. A couple of factors I think are going to be very important. Obviously, what's the state of public health on, leading up to September 30? And then just noticing, how did I miss it? Somehow, who's the governor on September 30th?
That's right.
I didn't talk about the recall. How did that not happen? obviously, assuming that the Governor Newsom, if he withstands the recall, I think there might be some more willingness to be flexible and provide some accommodation should the governor be recalled, and any of the, say, half dozen front runners were to take place. I think they have a much more restrained view on what should be being done in terms of COVID response. So if we do have a change in governorship, I would not necessarily, I would think we might return to more of a pre-pandemic setting than before. So, but given Governor Newsom's his approach, like I said, with the vaccination requirement, with the masking requirements, it seems reasonable to me that his office would be open to extending that and not wanting to create additional reasons for public gatherings where we have a demonstrated alternative that's worked well for the last year. So I don't have anything concrete. I think a letter and an official correspondence from the city to the administration, would be fantastic. I do know that at a certain point we'll start getting an echo chamber, and the more they can hear that, the more they, I think they just need to address the issue one way or the other. But, and I should note, last thing, under the executive order, the way it was written is it will take additional proactive action to extend that out, whereas before it was just in place until it was ended. Now, given that executive order, proactive action would need to be taken to extend it beyond September 30.
Thank you.
Great. Anything else?
Oh, I think that maybe it's too early, but I know you said briefly, and Johan had talked about in the budget where some grants and things like that might be available for Lafayette businesses or Lafayette nonprofits, our theaters. Are you at the point where you would feel comfortable saying where on these other line items where there might be resources for Lafayette, kind of our ability to actually get some of those dollars? Or at our next meeting, could you kind of bring back an update on how, and maybe by our city council meeting, there would be some more concrete stuff around what we might expect out of some of the resources.
Sure. Yeah, I think various programs are going to be in different stages of development. Those budget resources that essentially reallocate to existing programs, I think those will get out the door quicker. For example, we've already seen the Housing Homelessness Coordinating and Financing Council announce the funding allocations for the counties and the COCs. That built pretty much directly off of the HHAP program. So they were able to, I think they're going to be able to get out that funding pretty well. It's going to go in a couple different chunks, but they'll at least start to be able to get that funding out pretty quickly. Some of these other programs where they're going to have to start from scratch, I think it's going to take 6 months or so. I should have a better idea, though. We are definitely tracking from our internal sites. I think we've kind of rounded up all the various line items within parks and transportation, broadband, that we anticipate some of these programs will be coming out of, and we'll be monitoring and engaging in the various guideline and rulemaking processes as those come out. I think very broadly speaking, for those new programs, realistically, it's probably going to be a Q1 type application period with funding released towards the end of the fiscal year. For those programs, again, that are replenishments of existing programs, we can probably see that maybe move a quarter sooner. So, maybe we're going to see applications in Q4 with funding recommendations in Q1 going into next year.
Thank you.
That was exactly what I was, okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, I should note, I was remiss, the most direct money that the city is going to receive is from your $238,000 earmark that was received in the budget for the trail. Under the language that was included in the budget, that money cannot be released by Department of Finance prior to September 30th. I haven't yet heard exactly how they're going to be doing all these earmarks, because they don't normally go through the Department of Finance. They usually go through an implementing agency. I'm still of my colleagues think I'm crazy, but I'm still of the opinion that the Department of Finance is going to reach out to the controller and tell them to cut checks. So I think that, one day you're going to wake up on October 1st and there's just going to be an extra $238,000 in your bank account. But we're working to kind of get confirmation, because all of the earmarks within the budget are in that same process. But I do think that it's safe to say that for your specific earmark funding, we anticipate that will be coming early in Q4.
Great. So that answers my question. There's the state assistance metrics for rent relief. And I'm like, oh, that's not going to be early enough. Considering the moratorium, is there any chance we might get help?
The rental relief program is open now. That's open now. So so that funding is if either landlords or tenants are in need of that assistance, that is available to apply for now. It can extend beyond the eviction moratorium, so it could go towards, so the money doesn't have to be expended by the end of the eviction moratorium. I think my recollection is that if someone applies at the expiration of the moratorium, they cannot be evicted for at least 15 days if they've applied. So on September 30th, if someone applies, they can't be evicted for 2 weeks while their application's moving the way through their process. And then part of the agreement to accept the funding on the part of the landlord is that they will not evict the tenant. So,
great. So could we get that
resources.
information out to our, great. And how better would we get it out to people that don't get our notifications, right? That would be a creative thought. On outreach.
I know a lot of community-based organizations have been trying to work with people that don't have, maybe the internet access or use other, speak languages other than English as their primary language. So I know there's been a lot of nonprofit efforts, and there were leading into the most recent, legislation on this topic. I know that there was a lot of focus, and I think there were several articles, including in the LA Times, about the difficulty of reaching people that need this money the most. I know that at the state level, that's definitely been an issue. Is they have the funds, they have the federal funds, and it's just been trying to speed up and get it out. So, but that has
we should do this through our schools. We should try through our schools, right, as well. And I wonder if we can partner. I mean, there's, the kids' social media is maybe a good place to go, because they read, and they wouldn't necessarily read the stuff that we're reading. So maybe there's a thought on how to reach out to the kids who would tell their parents, right? Because I know that sometimes is very effective.
In GPAC's efforts, I know there were efforts to contact people who live in the downtown.
Mm-hmm.
I'll follow up with the team to see if they have any suggestions, and it may be creating a poster for the various complexes in the downtown.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead, Vice Mayor.
So the county has contracted or partnered with Richmond Community Foundation, and there are a lot of resources. I think Candace's newsletter has had a link. I know Supervisor Burgess's newsletter. So I can, Nirup, forward to you and Suzanne some of the collateral that they have in terms of making folks aware of it. But yes, definitely through the schools would be great. And Richmond Community Foundation actually has a grant program for outreach for, basically this very purpose, to get the word out.
It's not through their city? Is that through their city, or is that
No, the Richmond Community Foundation is just that. I mean, they're community foundation and they're doing grants. We worked with them on the census, and they helped to fund. The county had a grant program, but basically what Casey was saying is the partnership with nonprofits is how the state has been getting the word out. And the county, for their money, had the state running the program, but also then had the partnerships with the local nonprofits. And so I can check tomorrow on where they are in terms of those grant resources, but definitely there are flyers and lots of information and a link to websites on how to get it. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel from a communications perspective, but definitely the ideas for outreach that you're talking about are a good idea. So
yeah. So can you talk to the schools, or do you want me to help with that, Nirup, or our city manager?
Up to Richard and John.
Okay.
And yeah, definitely.
But also the newsletters, right? The individual school newsletters.
Right.
Perfect. Yeah.
And the
So let me know if you need
superintendent
help. Yeah.
Yeah, the superintendents can forward that out to the principals as well.
I'll work
For the
with Casey
newsletter.
on creating content, and Suzanne, and then we can send that off.
Great. Oh, that's great news. That is available right now. We need to do better reaching out. So the other thing was also just to come back at the next meeting if you see anything, especially in the housing monies or the economic development or the broadband, any of those things, if there's anything for Lafayette that we see that we can help. Were there any bills, keeping track of these bills and all these amendments and sending in new letters after amendments? Have you checked on the ones? I know you had the summary of the ones we've acted on. Are we up to date on all of those?
Yeah, for the letters that we've submitted so far, all of the current bills are moving through the process, and we've been resubmitting those. Once as bills move out of the Appropriations Committee in particular, I will probably be coming back to Nirup to reissue another set as those bills move to the floor. And then obviously as bills move to the governor's office, depending upon the will of the council, can either bring those back to council or be happy to just modify those to, reflect opposition, signature requests, veto requests, and move those over to the governor's office. So I think over the course of the next 6 weeks, you'll probably be seeing at least two rounds of letter requests again.
Perfect.
For positions that have already been taken.
Yeah.
Right.
The past practice is if the position hasn't changed or the bill hasn't been substantially amended, we will issue for your signature, Mayor, the letters to whichever level of committee it's being reviewed at, and also to the governor. We don't come back to the council because the positions haven't changed.
Perfect. Sounds great.
I did have a question about SB 10. Casey, you said it does not have to go to Senator Probst because there's no money to be considered. Does that, do we need to do anything ahead of the other bills, or do you think it's at the same time as the other bills?
Yeah, so SB 10 doesn't have a state fiscal impact, which is why I was able to bypass the Appropriations Committee. We've been working with, in particular, Assemblymember Bauer Cahan's office to provide her an update of where the city's at on all of your bill positions, particularly with housing. So once that bill moved to the floor, and obviously that's something that's, that she's going to be voting on, we have reached back out to her, make sure that she's aware of the city's position, the rationale behind the position, and has the letter. So as more bills in particular move on, particularly on the Assembly floor, but also similarly on the Senate side, we'll be reaching out to Ms. Glazer, Mr. Glazer, Ms. Bauer Cahan, to ensure that while they've received the letters previously as they were issued, want to go back through and be double checking with them and making sure that they have everything that they need. There are additional questions they have or anything like that. So we've already done that on SB 10, and like I said, as other bills start moving through and getting in front of them for their consideration, we'll be doing the same.
Thank you.
Great. So that's all I have. Oh, is there any public comment?
No, Mayor.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Anything else, Vice Mayor?
Nope.
City
Thank you.
Manager?
Just
Nope.
thank you.
Yeah, very much. Thank you. Very nice. Boy, you're right. There's a lot going on. My goodness. Thank you for keeping, I'm so glad that you're here and keeping us up to date on all this. I really appreciate it. So,
I have a sneaking suspicion we'll be hearing more from me.
yeah.
Legislature comes back.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you. I guess we
Thank
can
you.
adjourn the meeting.
Okay, thank you. Have a good evening.
Thanks.